This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. It's also a pleasure to have my long-lost co-host back again.
Hopefully not lost.
Yeah, been on the road quite a bit. In fact, this is your first opportunity to enjoy our brand new digs here, man. This is pretty cool. New logo. In the background.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
We're just we just can't help ourselves here. So anyway, whenever we're together, we try and pick at something, and which will be helpful, not the traditional. And we got one of those subjects today. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of stock buybacks. Okay, so interestingly enough, the first 3 quarters of 2014. There has been $160 billion of stock buybacks, which represents the second largest quarter in the history of stock buybacks. So it's obviously an active time. So let's, Scott, start by just sort of reviewing the thought process that companies have, and ultimately we want to look at what a board should be considering when it's proposed.
Right. Well, let's first just take a look at the health of the corporate balance sheet out there in the United States. If you look at U.S. corporations, there's about $2 trillion in cash sitting on the balance sheet in the U.S., and there's about $2 trillion in cash sitting on balance sheets outside of the United States. And so the number that you cite there is little under 10% of the U.S. domestic corporate balance sheet. And a lot of that is also fueled by debt as well. So not all companies are using cash to finance buyback, they're also using debt to finance that as well. So you've got a situation in corporate America today where the balance sheets are the strongest that they've ever been in history. And obviously coming out of the financial crisis, I think that's a good thing. The other thing that's really interesting that plays into this is been a topic that we've discussed on the show, the rise of the shareholder activists. And then the shareholder activists are taking the approach with many of these companies that the amount of cash that's sitting on the balance sheet should be put to better use. Most of that is essentially encouraged to return more to shareholders in the form of a stock buyback. And so there is pressure on a lot of companies to consider the various balances that certain large shareholders have and activist shareholders have in terms of returning that capital that's sitting on the balance sheet, earning very low interest rates back to shareholders, and as a duty and obligation back to shareholders. And those are 2 big things that are, I think, fueling this debate right now. And I think as companies look at this, it's really as sort of balancing that cost of capital, the need for capital for things like M&A and strategic acquisitions, and the need to drive further EPS growth, which is also something that a lot of companies are focused on. And buybacks are a routine way to continue to fuel growth in EPS.
Well, your explanation is a great segue into us talking about, let's take an example of one of those. Favorite company, Apple. Sure. Okay, obviously a great performer to the market. Those that held their shares were extremely happy. Okay, they post 2009, 2010 crisis accumulated $150 billion, okay, in cash on their balance sheet. They announced a $60 billion buyback, but that didn't stop activist Carl Icahn from putting the pressure on them publicly, and nobody has a better sort of forum than Icahn does. All he has to do is go on any of the TVs, and it's a great advantage that he has, but he had challenged Apple to return $150 billion back to the shareholders. Now, the part that gets quirky is Apple can't say, hey, here's what specifically I'm going to use the money for, okay? did they have a big, 50 billion of that was going to be for an acquisition of something significant.
Right.
So that's always the challenge when you have a balance sheet that's built up. Now it does put sometimes like in the old Disney days, it puts your company at risk.
Right.
Because somebody come in and say, hey,
Right.
I'll buy Disney because they have such a cash hoard, at this, that's a good thing. But so it isn't as easy as saying that, because you're sitting there saying, how do we best employ this? And as a long-term investor, which might be different than an activist, you're saying, geez, I'd like them to use that for product development, for acquisitions, for whatever, because I'm looking at building the growth of this company long-term. So your first of all, observation to
Sure.
that kind of scenario.
Sure. Well, if you're on a board, it truly depends on what industry that you're in. What are the needs for capital for things like acquisitions and investment back into the business? What is the relationship that the company has relative to its shareholders for earnings growth and or for dividends? And I think as you look across that spectrum, there's lots of different ways that you could fall out in terms of whether or not you should be keeping cash on the balance sheet or deploying it in things like stock buybacks. In industries where particularly in technology, where the industries are changing so rapidly, there is sort of a viewpoint that you need to have a lot of cash on hand to be able to do acquisitions as needed to strategically protect your position. Many of those tech companies haven't been able to deploy that and find those opportunities in the US, but they've been able to do that abroad. Many companies in the financial services industry are coming out of the financial crisis and saying, hey, look, my need for current capital, short-term capital, can be very high, especially when my sources of liquidity dry up. And so they're holding on to more cash than they had historically. And so I think those are two different counterbalances that companies need to look at. But again, I think if you're a board member, you have to take into account all those things and then make the right decision relative to what the strategy that you communicated out to shareholders is, and then execute on that.
Yeah. Now it used to be a little easier because there used to be the tax benefit for the stock buybacks.
Right.
Okay. And then especially versus dividends, which would be at ordinary income, the Jobs and Growth Tax Reconciliation Act took care of, took that benefit away. But the question, and I know the answer to this, but I want to ask you this for the benefit. When you look at stock buybacks versus dividends, there are considerations that will force you one way or the other.
Right. Well, I mean, I think very, very clear. Dividends is much more of a longer term policy about a yield profile, attracting a specific type of investor. You don't really come in and out of dividends. Once you sort of have declared a dividend,
you're in trouble.
Yeah, but I mean, you want to state a clear mission that's returning capital to shareholders in a very organized fashion. You have to have a lot of degree of visibility into your ability to continue to pay that dividend, because once declared, investors do expect you to maintain that dividend and increase that dividend over time. So that's definitely more of a longer term consideration, where a cash buyback, you can come in and out of the market opportunistically. You can declare a large buyback program that signals to your investors that you are going to be friendly in returning capital to shareholders, and then be able to go about and execute that buyback opportunistically as you see the market evolve. And so I think certainly a buyback gives you more flexibility than a dividend, certainly, but a dividend opens you up to a different whole set of investors that, again, if you're trying to attract that type of investor, long-term shareholders, a lot of pension funds, institutional funds, they do like dividend-paying stocks.
So, again, in the quest that we have each week to give the directors as much information as we can, there are times when there are scenarios when stock buybacks, at least by letter of the law, are not good decisions. So when would there be examples that maybe it's not a good decision to do?
Well, you obviously have to be careful around stock buybacks in the context of acquisitions. Anytime there's corporate actions going on, you have to be sensitive to that. You have to be sensitive around the buying of shares during appropriate windows and blackout periods. That's very appropriate. And again, it has to be consistent with the message that you've communicated out to your shareholders. And I think certainly today, and we've been talking about this for years, understanding your shareholder base and your largest shareholders and their desire for you to deploy capital in various different ways is extremely important today. Those companies that are tone deaf to their largest shareholders, particularly as it relates to this use of capital and cash balance sheets, are probably more subject to risk of activist type of activity than those that have an active dialogue and are clearly executing a strategy towards capital deployment in an efficient manner. And so that's a message we hear in literally almost every single one of these programs.
The message that is also sent by any of these transactions is, we think our stock is undervalued, okay? Because why else would you have sort of the face? It's almost like an insider buying decision, okay? And it triggers, in the market typically, it triggers a bump in your stock because it's almost like a voice of confidence that says, I'm confident of where this stock is going.
Yeah, I'm not sure that everybody looks at it as whether or not your stock is undervalued or overvalued, because you're taking shares out of the market. That does create EPS growth. Investors want to see EPS growth, and so they want to see that you're deploying your capital to help drive earnings as well. It's not smoke and mirrors. Also, I mean, investors do expect you to do that. So I wouldn't necessarily look at it from a board perspective to say, hey, board, do we think the stock is undervalued, yes or no, and then make a determination to do a buyback. I think it's much more earlier in that to say, what is the most optimal use of our capital? What do shareholders expect us to use and how to deploy this capital? And then this should be one of the various mechanisms you do that to expand growth and have earnings power over time.
Yeah, well, one thing's for sure. If there were days that you could keep that on your balance sheet and not have criticism, they aren't there anymore. I mean, you're gonna, as a board, you're gonna need to be responsible to activists and shareholders that aren't gonna let you do that. And hopefully, again, in some cases when the buildup happens, there are specific plans that come to fruition that people will see. But in cases where that's not the case.
But it's pretty amazing we're having this debate. I mean, the financial crisis is still very much in our short-term memory, and oh, how quickly the sentiment has changed to say, oh, all of a sudden you have a significant amount of cash on the balance sheet, you should be returning that to shareholders right away. There's still a lot of executives that are in the seat that saw that time period and are a lot more conservative than they were before. And so while we're at historically high levels in terms of buyback activity, which some people say is that a signal that we should be worried that corporate America is buying in a frothy market, I actually don't look at it that way. The balance sheets are stronger than they've ever been before.
Well, and to your point about financial services, with the capital restrictions that a lot of businesses have, but particularly financial services, nobody wants to cut that too close to the vest. What about if you had another loan loss, situation or whatever? You just can't take that risk.
Right.
So, well, I hope we've done justice, to this topic. We may have to look to the counter. We have to look at splitting the stock.
Yes.
One of these as a
Right.
topic for
Right.
the future, because that's another type of challenge that boards will be presented at times. But Scott, thanks for joining and filling in the blanks on stock buybacks. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member and committee member. We'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton. And contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.